All right, little technology snafus. So before I begin, well, here's a bit of a brief outline about my presentation. I'm gonna do a meandering river today because that's how I am. And we'll talk about both my dissertation work in degraded mines and how that really got me thinking more about tribal consultation and to what I'm currently working on in Indigenous data sovereignty and why I think it's so relevant to all of you in the work that you do here at MIT. But I was always taught before you tell me what you know, I want to know who you are. And so a little bit to contextualize myself and build relationships with you all. So my name is Lydia Jennings. I'm a member or citizen of the Pascua Yaqui tribe on my father's side and a citizen of the Huichol or Wirikuta people on my mother's side. The Pascua Yaqui tribe is in southern Arizona, really close in proximity to my field site. And then the Huichol people are actually in Mexico. And so I am a binational indigenous person. My love for the environment and pursuing environmental studies came from running. And as you heard, I'm still a very passionate trail runner. I actually ran the Boston Marathon on Monday. Thank you. I dedicate each mile to examples of tribal nations putting land back in practice. And so there's a very exhaustive Twitter thread if you want to check that out and talk about and learn more about what land back means. But beyond that, I'm a scholar, I'm an environmental scientist. I earned my bachelor's at California State University, Monterey Bay. I worked for several years for UC Davis as an environmental toxicologist. And this allowed me to sample all the major rivers in California. And in that process, I really saw how specifically communities of colors are more impacted by environmental contamination. And urban communities are more impacted by environmental contamination. And so I wanted to use my passion for science to be part of the solution. And that took me to the University of Arizona to address one of the biggest contaminants to our tribal nation, mining. And so that's what I'm here to talk to you all about today. I'm also a proud graduate of the class of 2020. That was one heck of a year to graduate. And that's kind of what that Patagonia film that David mentioned earlier is about, is I had to create my own ceremony, and running, of course, is just a really central part of that. So I honored 50 Indigenous scientists along Bow Bay. You can tell kind of a theme. I like to use running in honor. But for the purpose of today, I think it's also really important to contextualize these conversations with policies and how they've been instrumental in removing us from our homelands. Everything as historical as the Manifest Destiny policies to even things more contemporary in the 1970s. You know, Native people in Arizona weren't allowed to vote until 1975. And so though this may seem historic to many people, this is very contemporary issues that we are still navigating today. And so here's just a few of the policies that will kind of go into some of this work. I think it's also really critical that we recognize the land stewards, the past, present, and future. And that's really why I'm an educator, is because I think about the future generations, taking this knowledge that we are generating to really support future land sovereignty and land futures. And I think we have enough data now that's really demonstrating Indigenous land stewardship is vital to biodiversity. This is a paper from Nature in 2018 that looked at biodiversity measurements on all major continents, and it compared that to protected and natural ecosystems. And in every single one of those continents and globally, Indigenous people have the most biodiverse lands. Biodiversity was measured in terms of plant species richness and vertebrate plants. I'm currently looking at something very similar and looking at soil biodiversity, which is a very hard metric to quantify in the same capacity. But I think, you know, we've had work since 2007. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues published this very highly cited statistic that though Indigenous peoples manage less than a quarter of the Earth's land base, within that is 80% of global biodiversity. Native communities continue to be at the forefront of also addressing and trying to assert sovereignty and being the most put at potential physical harm in this process. This is why I think having Indigenous-led scholarship in the environmental realm is so critical. So for me, I really thought about that in terms of mining. And if I'm from the state of Arizona, mining is a major industry there. And looking at my own community, we see that though 40% of mines are on or bordering tribal nations in a state that has 22 federally recognized tribes. And so in yellow really are all the tribal nations, and you can kind of see the gold stars are major mines in close proximity to tribal nation, and others, the black circles are more rural mines. And so this is a really critical issue that is impacting Indigenous communities. As I mentioned, now we'll kind of go to my guiding research questions. So for me, in my scholarship, I'm really interested in how Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges and local community knowledges foster more resilient ecosystems and knowledge systems. I take this an approach of thinking about the term resiliency, both from an environmental science perspective, as well as an indigenous science and cultural resiliency. So as an environmental scientist, we think of resiliency in this context of helping reclaim ecosystems, restoring the function and structure in response to environmental stressors, in my case, mining. But we also recognize that resiliency means that the land is not going to be identical to the pre-mining conditions. And it really is a term that best addresses above and below ground dynamics, particularly in soil health. Indigenous science thinks of resiliency and cultural resiliency as its adaptive capacity despite adversity, specifically colonization, but also means land degradation. And really reestablishing this relational worldview and recognizing a strength and kinship with places. And so my goal as an Indigenous scientist is to really bring together these two definitions of resiliency. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that dissertation, the soil health component of my scholarship. I was looking at a parcel of land that was leased from the Tohono tribe, a tribe adjacent to my own, and looked up above and below ground temporal patterns as this area recovered post-mining. And so again, talking about mining, and particularly in the Arizona copper mining, is there echo? Sorry. Copper is one of the best semiconductors that we use in most of our electronics, particularly as we start to shift towards more renewable technologies. The demand for copper is increasing exponentially. But where is that going to come from? If it's not coming from us in the United States, who are the majority consumers of copper, then we are exporting that pollution to other parts of the world that don't have the same environmental standards or worker safety protections. And so we really have to be developing these technologies to protect the land while also addressing the power dynamics of who's being impacted by mining. And that's really what got me into thinking about this project and this problem overall. Mining in Arizona is an $8 billion industry. It's one of our 5 major industries, but it creates massive land disturbances, either from those open mining copper pits that are very prevalent, or from mine tailings. And that's what I worked on, is restoring mine tailings. For those of you who don't know, in a single pound of copper that's removed, 99% of it is rejected as waste. So these are vast amounts, mountains of mine tailings that are pretty devoid of heavy metals. And so they can be really challenging to establish in a very arid environment like the Sonoran Desert. While most research has looked at mining reclamation, it's been done in more temperate environments like North Carolina, West Virginia, those types of areas, not so much in the Sonoran Desert, despite it not being one of the primary places that mining is happening today. So I've talked a bit about mine tailings, but what are they? So mine tailings are the byproduct of that extraction process. They're about the size and consistency of cooking flour. And in the dry Sonoran Desert area that can be very dusty, those can easily get into the local dust transport, and people can inhale those. It can pollute the air, soil, and water quality. And so it's really critical for the mining industry to stabilize these as quickly and as cost efficiently as possible. Here's a windy event from one of my field sites that happened in 2009. This resulted in a $450,000 penalty to the mining company. So it's also to their benefit to invest in these types of technologies to build better relationships with neighboring communities, but also to prevent themselves from getting sued. So one strategy that's utilized is called cap and plant, and that's taking soil from an offsite desert area and putting it on top of the tailings to really establish a soil cap. And then further establishing a vegetative cap on top of that to prevent from any wind and water erosion. And that's the crux of what my research did. So the site that I worked on was just south of where I live in Tucson, Arizona. It was land that was leased from the Tohono Nation. This is really important because they were instrumental, since this land was leased from them, in picking what kind of plants were seeded and also being much more proactive in determining how much soil is going to be used for that soil cap. So let's do a little close-up of that. And so this is an overview. It's a 600-acre area. What I want to bring attention to is that soil cap area came from these 2 borrow pits. So borrow pit source 1 and borrow pit source 2. These topsoil areas down here in the southern sections, those had soil from 0 to 15 feet deep, and the subsoil areas had soil from 15 to 30 feet deep. So different types of soil quality that we were curious that might influence the type of revegetation success. When we began sampling this area, it had already been reclaimed, and so we were kind of studying what the consultant firms were doing in practice. These are all seeded with the same seed mix, and they were not watered, so these are natural volunteer species from those seed mix that survived. And so in that first year sampling, I just want to point out that these two subsoil areas appeared to be dominated by grasslands, and the two topsoil areas appeared to be more dominated by shrubs. And so we wanted to see, what is the soil telling us about the health that might account for these differences? And so just as a kind of brief timeline, we started after it had been seeded for 5 years. We sampled for 6 years in our temporal study, ended in 2019. So that really represented 11 years since that area had been seeded. I evaluated a series of above and below ground parameters, and for the purpose of today, I'm only going to go over 4 of them. So we looked at total plant community cover, the final plant community structure, the DNA biomass, and the total nitrogen. I also really want to highlight the seed mixture that was used, because this was actually chosen by the Thought Optum Nation. They picked and chose to invest in 34 plant species. Typically, the mining company chooses to only invest in like 7 or 8. They chose plants that were culturally significant. They chose plants that were native to Sonoran Desert, that were adapted to grow on these mine tailings and waste rocks, and they were cost efficient, locally available. The other part is the majority of the plants they chose were not bioaccumulative of any types of heavy metals. And though we did background measurements of heavy metals in the area, that was not one of the primary goals of this particular project. Previous work had really looked and tested these plants for bioaccumulation. So our primary research question was, what are these below ground indicators? How do those change with vegetation establishment temporally? And so first, because we're looking at this vegetation establishment, let's talk about that. This is a NOVA analysis of that first year we went out sampling. What I want to highlight is the southeast and the southwest, the two topsoil areas. And you see in that southwest topsoil area, starting the first year is statistically higher in plant coverage than the other 3 treatment areas, including the other topsoil area. And that's kind of a photo of it. When we look at our patterns over time temporally, this southwest section again is over here. And though it started out higher, it did not statistically change with time, while the other 3 treatment areas did improve with time over that 6-year temporal pattern, including the other topsoil area. I also want to point out that all of these areas from the first year on of our sampling exceeded that of the natural desert ecosystem. Now, we also measured the final plant community structure because we thought it was so interesting that those topsoil areas appeared to be more dominated by shrubs in comparison to the subsoil areas. And in fact, that we found in the final year of our analysis that only the southwest was dominated by shrubs. The other topsoil area, the southeast, kind of was aligning up to be more dominated by shrubs, but was still dominated by grasslands. And the 2 subsoil areas were dominated by grasses. Now, as we look at the below ground indicators, DNA biomass is one that we use. It's not as commonly used to look at soil health, but we chose it as an all-encompassing measurement of archaea, fungi, and bacteria, essential micronutrient or microbial actors in the soil. Again, looking at that first year of our measurements or sampling, and we see that southwest quadrant is again much more higher than the other 3 treatment areas in terms of DNA biomass. And as we look at the temporal trends, that southwest started out higher and increased with time. The other topsoil area, the southeast, also increased with time statistically. And the 2 subsoil areas increased, but not statistically. We see much more upward trends happening in those areas. All of these, only the southwest quadrant actually was exceeding that of the natural desert ecosystem. So there's this interesting pattern and dynamic of soil health that's happening there. And I'll only show one more metric today, and that's total nitrogen. Nitrogen is a really essential macronutrient in the Sonoran Desert. It's very often a plant limiting nutrient for plants to grow in the area. And so once again, measuring that total nitrogen in the first year, the southwest quadrant is higher than the other topsoil area, and that of higher than the other 3 treatment areas. As we look at the temporal trends, much like the plant coverage, the southwest total nitrogen remained relatively stable, though higher. And only the other topsoil area, the southeast over here, increased with time, while these 2 subsoil areas were slowly building up, but did not retain kind of stability or increase statistically. And none of them actually reached the levels that found in the natural desert ecosystem. So we think maybe that might be a slower potential indicator. So the next question we really wanted to explore, what are the below ground indicators that associate with above ground plant establishment, and how do these change with time? And so we actually went ahead and did a multilinear regression of all of our data over time points. What I want to highlight is kind of an interesting trend in the different types of metrics and what became important over time. And so we see in this first year, the DNA biomass being important, but really driven by the Southwest quadrant treatment. And then we see over time, the different years, we see pH really sticking out. And let me show that. And so pH ended up being important in 3 of the 4 years, but very different slopes, which we're still determining more what might be before this paper is published. But what I want to highlight that I think this important analysis showed both temporally and through these multilinear regressions is that different metrics become important at different points in the reclamation process. And so these are suggestions that we can demonstrate to the mining companies that different type of metrics they can do over time. So this research is really the first time that a long-term field study was done with the mining industry in the study of arid restoration. And we really think that both above and below ground metrics are vital to really help mining companies go from these revegetation failures. This is another part of the property that was reclaimed by the mining company using much different techniques, versus revegetation successes, such as this one that was done by the Thona Otham land managers. We believe our best indicators over time are pH, soil nitrogen, and DNA biomass, but that those metrics can really, the type of metrics that you're going to be measuring throughout the reclamation process are going to vary. And also that Thona Otham Nation seed selection was really part of what made this site successful. Now, these are really important tools that we can work with the mining company, but what got me as an Indigenous scholar really interested is why there are so many mines that are on our bordering tribal communities. And though we are taking into consideration Indigenous knowledge in the reclamation process, how come we don't take that into the same kind of consideration when we're proposing new mines or thinking about environmental impact statements? So I'm a researcher and I had to go down that rabbit hole as well. And so this takes me to the next part of really looking at a local mine in close proximity to this one and exploring the NEPA, the tribal consultation process, and the role of the 1872 General Mining Law. And I wanted to see how effective are these laws in representing Indigenous epistemologies. And so I know we have a mix of people here. I'm an environmental scientist, so I had to do a lot of catching up learning and learning federal Indian law, learning environmental law to really understand the nuances of these policies. And so just as a brief overview, the 1872 General Mining Law, it's a law that's over 150 years old. It continues to be the principal charter governing hard rock mining to date, even though the technology for mining has varied so much. And it was really enacted during that time of manifest destiny, when we as Indigenous people were not seen to be sovereign people who can make our own decisions about our environments. Yet this is the policy that continues to endure and regulate what happens in our tribal nations today. And I also think what's really important is that it recognizes that all valuable mineral deposits on lands owned by the US are open to exploration and purchase, but not for mine storage. And that's going to become a really critical part of this case study later on. So I just wanted to mention it. This is actually the field site that I was working in, or this mine is proposed on, and right across from the mountains I was working in when it was mined in the 1900s. And again, it's being revisited to mine further. The other part I think is so important is to talk about tribal consultation. Many people first heard really about tribal consultation during the Dakota Access Pipeline, but it's been a long enduring commitment that the federal government needs to be doing. But what consultation means has really varied. Basically, companies and the government have to consult with tribes whether or not a project is on public or private land when it comes to infrastructure or energy development. And it's executed through a variety of policies. Many archaeologists know the National Historic Preservation Act. Environmental scientists often think about NEPA and the really critical role that is. It's a big purpose in my life to make sure that any environmental scientist person is thinking about NEPA and thinking about the role of tribal consultation, because it is critical in all projects moving forward. But again, I said not all tribal consultation is not the same. So tribal consultation was really formalized in 2009 by the Obama administration. And kind of prior to that, was really recognized by many tribal nations as something that was more of a notification process. companies would reach out to tribal nations and say, hey, we're going to have a project. You need to respond to this by this and this time. Often those notifications would go out during ceremonial times or be held in places that were really hard for community members to meet. And so there wasn't adequate time for tribal nations to really disagree with what was happening or to raise substantive issues. And so this is really a process that, again, tribal nations tend to refer to as a notification, not just consultation. Today, we see consultation progressing and improving, and we tend to think of it as more of a meaningful process where tribal nations can engage more of in a dialogue, and they have early and regular consultation that's required today. But it still has place for improvement and meaning, improvement. And so now we see a lot of the language moving towards this process of collaborative consultation, where Native nations have the ability to affect the outcome. And it's a really collaborative process between federal agencies, tribal nations, and industry, and that tribal nations have the ability to influence decision-making outcomes and timelines. And that timeline one is really important. But it's still not the ultimate goal. Aspirational, some might say, I think very much in the future is the process of consent in consultations. And that really ensures free, prior, and informed consent, and that tribal nations are involved in all the project timelines. It really maximizes the opportunities for mutual collaborations. And we actually have already seen some policy introduced into state bills in the state of Washington. So again, it might be seen as aspirational by some, but I think this is actually the future direction of consultation. So that kind of led me into this aspect of NEPA, which is the Basic Environmental Charter of the United States. It's executed through the Department of Interior. So who the Department of Interior Secretary is really important. And right now it's a very beautiful time to have Deb Haaland and a woman from Laguna Pueblo in that role, but it doesn't mandate substantive results. It does require community involvement. And so this is kind of an overview of NEPA from the Citizens Guide to NEPA. What I want to highlight, I know it's a lot of information in this figure, is that those three boxes are kind of the three tools of assessment of NEPA. And a really common complaint by tribal nations is that particularly the environmental assessments and the environmental impact statements are far too late to be considered free, prior, and informed consent. So we're all the way down in the fourth stage of this process of developing a project. Where do we really have time to make substantive changes in this? The other part is that often, particularly in this public review, tribal nations and our knowledge are considered archaeological or historic, and we're not seen as the contemporary knowledge holders that we are. And so how can this information be adequate in expressing our expertise of our own ecosystems? So now this takes me to, that's a little policy background, right? But now to the actual case itself. So the proposed Rosemont, it would potentially produce about 10% of copper for the entire United States. It would be the third largest copper mine if approved. The majority of it would be happening on National Forest Service land, as well as about 1,000 acres on private land. And they would create around 3,000 jobs, maybe for the next 10 to 20 years. They would impact over 7 different endangered species, including the jaguar. There's been 3 found down there now. And many tribal nations in the area, including my own, really think that the jaguar is the embodiment of how sacred this area is. And the fact that we've seen 3 of them there speaks to the volumes of how this area would be impacted. There's also 65 sacred springs in this area, the Sonoran Desert, where water is a very scarce resource. And there's multiple historical burial sites and ancestral remains in this area. So to take this away when there's already 3 active mines, and the previous section I was talking about was in the town of Sahuarita right here. There's another mine here in the town of Green Valley. And then here, so 3 different mines already happening in that area. There's a question of like, is that enough? Don't we already have enough mines, particularly given all of these considerations? So in terms of the tribal consultation, the mining process, mine lease process, and the consultation process began in 2009, before it was formalized by the Obama administration. And so they went through all of the proper NEPA notification steps. It took over 10 years. They met with over 16 different federal tribes and agencies, over 1,000 years of study. But the big issue and contest is that the Tohono Nation was not met with, which is the primary tribe leading this, was not met in a meaningful consultation process. They were met with a notification process. And they didn't have an ability to really influence that outcome. And they, since the very beginning, formalized in a tribal statement, said, we don't want this. And so the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Forest Service really failed to engage in meaningful consultation with the tribe before issuing a very vital Clean Water Act permit. So it was, but regardless, it was approved and resulted in 3 different lawsuits that are still pending today. And so my tribe, the Tohono and the Hopi tribes, which is actually from way up north, but they have pilgrims that have ancestrally come down to this area, recognize that this mine would cause spiritual harm and would harm irreplaceable traditional resource collection areas. This is actually a photo of the mountain that I took out running. And so they partnered also with the Center for Biological Biodiversity and a nonprofit, community nonprofit called Save the Santa Ritas to result in 3 different lawsuits of this area. And kind of the current status is a little bit outdated now, but though the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers approved that Clean Water Act permit, it went to the Court of Appeals, and actually the Court of Appeals overturned the U.S. Forest Service's approval of the mine. And it's really interesting, it's not because of lack of tribal consultation, it's because of a very rare interpretation of the general mining law that, and I want to just kind of point this as an overview of where the mine was going to go. And what you see is that these tailings, those same things I was working to reclaim, are being stored on national forest land, while the mining pit itself is actually on private land. And so had this been reversed, there would be no issue. But for some reason, they chose to interpret that you cannot store tailings on national public lands. And that's the first time it's been interpreted. There hasn't been another interpretation since. Naturally, then that actually resulted in the judge overturning the U.S. Forest Service approval as well because of the impact to endangered species. So it gave momentum to overturn that. Since the mining company has submitted a reply, and they should be decided in early 2023, but it's a very rare interpretation, and it's really exciting to see what happens. I also think there might have been some momentum with the last administration. So again, we will see what happens. But I also think it's really highlighted, this case study has highlighted how the general mining law is incredibly outdated. Mining from when this law first enacted has shifted so much. It's bigger, it's more technologically advanced. We've seen both Tom Udall and my own chairman, or Representative Raul Grijalva in Arizona, introduced the Hard Rock Leasing and Reclamation Act. Unfortunately, it was killed by Joe Manchin. And so it really kind of comes back to this question, right? As the mining industry has extracted some 300 billion worth of these minerals from public lands since 1872. So how much of this is wealth that's lost to tribal nations? And how are we going to move forward if we have politicians who aren't advocating in the same capacity that the nations want? But I think the other part is that I feel makes me feel hopeful is we see since the Obama administration, or excuse me, the Biden administration, is how there is this elevation of indigenous traditional knowledges in federal policy decision-making process, and how that gets formalized into policy is supposed to be decided at the end of this year. And also on strengthening tribal consultation as nation-to-nation relationships. And I think those are both really exciting. But again, how they get executed is going to be critical. But I also think this case study has highlighted is that both the mining industry and tribal nations have very similar critiques of the general mining law and the NEPA process. The mining industry says it's ambiguous on what consultation means. It's far too timely. They need better coordination amongst federal agencies and tighter timelines, which makes sense, right? Time is money. But tribal nations also think it's ambiguous on what consultation means, and that NEPA does not represent their interests. It's a very wardship relationship, and that traditional metrics of measuring environmental impact don't value sacred and spiritual concerns and don't value traditional ecological knowledge. You know, something that's commonly said is there isn't a metric to measure sacredness, but that's what NEPA EIS statements value. So how do we approach that? Don't know. But what I also think is really important is we recognize there's a need for reformation. The other part is I think it's really important to see how tribal nations globally are striving to build new structures of consultation. And so we see tribal nations putting tribal consultation definitions into their tribal code and tribal law. A great example is the Maya people of Belize, who have in their tribal constitution, what does tribal consultation mean? Who pays for it? What are the timelines? They actually have timelines for them to respond with a culturally appointed lawyer. And so I think those are more steps that I would love to see tribal nations embrace to protect their own resources. We also see tribal nations are establishing their own fleet of researchers. And so there's a really great partnership between the University of Minnesota and the Fond du Lac Lake Chippewa, who are training environmental consultants of their own nation with culturally informed cultural assessments. And so I think that's another really exciting example. And then lastly, I think is really seeing how tribal nations are effectively using international policy to enhance tribal consultation. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is a great example of that. We have a paper that we're working on that specifically highlights what UNDRIP highlights in terms of the laws and policies and responsibilities of researchers and consultants when working with tribal nations. The other part, so I guess out of this, I really want to highlight the conclusions is that in the current legal frameworks, our interests are not well represented. It makes sense because this is written at a time when we weren't seen as sovereign peoples. The mining law has really caused a severe injury to our nations, and our reserve rights are sacred ecosystems. And I don't say sacred sites because a site can be built around, but an ecosystem entails our soil, water, and air quality, our burial sites, and our culture, and our human and non-human kin. But there's major improvements happening in terms of environmental sciences and Indigenous peoples' rights and how they intersect to provide this more holistic understanding of both environmental and industry responsibilities. Okay, so last part, Indigenous data governance. And thank you for coming along this meandering river with me. All of this got me in terms of reading NEPA and environmental impact statements is I was really alarmed at how much information tribal nations are sharing in order to protect our sacred ecosystems. And there's been a really big movement happening right now to digitize all of those environmental impact statements, which on one hand would be really, really cool. But on the other hand, there is information I was sharing with my own cultural leadership, and they're like, how do you know that? Like, you shouldn't know that. That's knowledge that's supposed to be held for like our male elder leaders. And like, it was in the it was in the reviews. And so it really got me to thinking a lot about Indigenous data governance and how do we put the information out there to protect our cultural resources while also making sure that we're not setting up our communities to be data mined into the future. So this takes me to this big, this is got a lot of attention in 2017 from The Economist, recognizing that data, our data, is now more valuable than oil. And thinking about what that means. So I work in Indigenous data sovereignty. I'm a data science fellow right now. And we think about data and data sovereignty and data governance. The mainstream definitions really think about this aspect that information has been converted and stored in this binary digital format. And it's subject to the laws or country in which it's located. So it's really geographically bound. And it's interesting when we work with international collaborators because they won't use Google Docs that has US licenses, but they will use ones that have UK licenses because of the protections associated with that. And the other part is this data governance part, really thinking about the ownership, the control, the collection, the analysis, and the use of data. And really thinking about the ownership in terms of corporate ownership, not community ownership. That often happens with the programs we use to do analysis. And so thinking about those mainstream definitions and how they don't recognize that us as Indigenous people have always been data experts. These are 4 different traditional methods of measuring data. So everything from a totem pole to a winter count, from a hide of the Lakota Sioux, I believe. This is a Tohono O'odham calendar stick, and then also the Haudenosaunee wampum belt. So those are just a few methods. There's also oral histories, plant histories. Like, our Native people have always been data experts. But when we think about Indigenous data, most people don't tend to think of it really in terms of data about us as individuals, our demographic data, our health and social data, commercially held data, maybe some in terms of our geological information, our water information. What about the difference between us as nations, our traditional and cultural information, our oral histories, our literature, our ancestral knowledge, our community stories? These are all data that we as tribal nations have to think about. And all of you as data practitioners need to think about and how to govern it in a way that is ethically just. So this is what I work on now, is Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. And so when we think about Indigenous data sovereignty, it stems from the sovereignty position within our federal and state recognition. And I think it's important to note that who is not recognized is also important too. For example, we have a researcher in our group who's from Botswana. Botswana has 7 different indigenous peoples there, but only one is recognized, whose state language is recognized. And there's a reason why, because they're more favorable to that governmental policies. So I think it's really important that we recognize that. The other part is court cases. So many people are familiar right now with Magritte case happening in the state of Oklahoma. Another place that we recognize our tribal sovereignty position within. Treaties. That's kind of their first contract. I was just up visiting the Wampanoag tribe, and they recognize we have treaties with the British Crown. Why do we need federal recognition? And then lastly, thinking about international policy. And so the UNDRIP, international treaties that we can really speak to. So all of this is really what tribal sovereignty and indigenous data sovereignty stems from. And there's a range of how we control that data. So something like social media, we have very low control of, but something like tribal enrollment, we have very high control of. And so this is really where, in terms of enhancing our data relationships, we have to have them on the entire spectrum within. So the other part is, I think, recognizing many people talk about tribal nations as stakeholders. We are rights holders, given from all of those other definitions I recognized. But that all of us in different various roles, and this is some of the work that we do with indigenous data sovereignty, is recognizing and talking to all these different people within the data ecosystem. So data repositories, how are we thinking about indigenous data governance? Publishers, who has access to information, researchers, granting agencies, universities. It's really important that we recognize the data role stewardship that we have in each of these phases. Now, I'm an environmental scientist, and it's a big movement happening in my field is open science. And that's this notion to make our scientific data more accessible and more equitable. It's how we believe we are going to address inequities in our science ecosystem. And as data intensive scientific discovery becomes more and more common, this open support and sharing and preservation and provenance and reproducibility of our data is really critical. You have to do data management plans for any projects you do. We have so many amazing open source platforms today. And it's really important that we do so because we do have a reproducibility crisis in our research. But also, a question that I think a lot about is open science for who? We still have tribal nations that don't have internet access. So is open science for us? And that's something I hope that you all reflect on. So let's talk a little bit more about some of these challenges of open science and data governance for Indigenous people. Largely, our communities are not the legal rights holders of our data, who are universities, databases, individual researchers. There's major issues in terms of responsibility and ownership of data, as well as recognizing there's really incomplete and mistakes often within metadata that continue to live in the digital lives of material. So for example, in my research, I identified many plant species, and it would say in the SEIUNet, which is one of the major herbarium databases, this plant is used medicinally by Indian people. Like who? Like whose land? Like who's that knowledge coming from? I don't know. So I think just thinking about those types of pieces. There's also a huge amount of data that's held in collections and museums and libraries. I just visited Harvard yesterday, and I saw so many ancestral knowledge and counting sticks and Chapaweka masks from my tribe that don't have proper appropriate provenance for them. So what happens to that data? I have some colleagues who say that going through these major repositories and recognizing the ownership and recognizing what's there is the first step to addressing data sovereignty so that our communities can know what information is out there about us and how to protect it moving forward. And then also, I think it's really important. I'm a huge proponent of having more traditional ecological knowledge in all science, but we also have to think about the responsibilities of that before we generate new knowledge. And so thinking about what are our responsibilities as scientists, of what responsibilities do we have to community experts before we put this all and make it all open access. So that's where actually the protocols of the FAIR and CARE. So many data scientists are trained in making sure that your data is findable, accessible, interpretable, and reusable. And that's really one of the basis of creating data management plans today. But the other part that's been established by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, GIDA, is the CARE protocols. So thinking about your data in terms of the collective benefit, thinking about who has authority to control that data, what are the responsibilities of you as a researcher, and the ethics of that research. And so the FAIR protocols really seek to increase data sharing, and they complement very well with the CARE protocols that really give critical considerations for non-tribal entities and data creators and users. And so as Indigenous data sovereignty, we really position this and thinking about the practical tools that are created, the policy and legislation, the capacity building that's happening, the formal standards and those legal tools as we go about and create more data and data ecosystems. So I want to give a couple of recommendations for today. I think recognizing institutional responsibilities for Indigenous data governance is critical. The CARE principles really need to be centered. We can enrich metadata, provenance, permissions, attributions protocols. I mean, we are here at MIT with so many people who have technical expertise to put that kind of enrichment into the metadata. And I'll have a couple of tools in the following slides that might help. Recognizing Indigenous intellectual property through appropriate authorship and acknowledgement, and protecting both personal and community identifiable information. For example, I might be in a community pool of Indigenous researchers, but there's not a lot of Yaqui environmental scientists out there. And so it's a very easy way to identify who I am, despite it being protected pool. Also formalizing voluntary guidelines and tracking data use and reuse. So here's a few tools to enrich metadata. The Local Context Hub, a free program, has actually a way to put in traditional knowledge labels and biocultural labels into the metadata. They also can include notices of if this work was community approved to be available. And so those are really important steps. And these are something that you can do in actually all phases of a data life cycle. And so this is really what we want to do with Indigenous data sovereignty moving forward, is ensure that we have these protocols in every step along the way. The other part is tracking data use and reuse. Now, it's a really common tool with a lot of databases. You can download the data, they keep track of that. And so we can work in with large collections and a lot of large data repositories to begin to track the data and who's using it and where they're using it, and really ensure that it's within the protocols and intentions of the tribal nations whose data it is care about. The last part I think is always important is recognizing who's credited for knowledge in repositories, publications, and research findings. Consider those community contexts if that's appropriate. And so in the big data landscape, as I kind of close up here, I want us to think deeply about the types of programmings that we have available. So this is a great figure by Matt Turek. He looks at all the kind of data types of tools, big data science tools that are available, looking at 2012 all the way to 2021. And you can see they just have tripled in terms of the types of tools and programming formats. And so the question is, where is the data ethics within that? How have those grown or not grown, right? The other part is I study mining and mining reclamation, and I see some really important parallels. And part of that is, in mining policy, we see, the gold rush really started in the 1850s, but we didn't see environmental policy to regulate until about 100 years later. 30 years later, we're really thinking about the social responsibility of our mining. We're still working on formalizing tribal consultation, and we haven't yet hit that plateau. And as we think about the data mining aspect or large data science, we see open data was first used. We see this recognition of this as being a discipline, really, establishing these FAIR and now CARE principles. But we have not yet really been clear about the data governance environment. And I just really hope in studying both metal mining and comparing that to data mining that we don't repeat the same mistakes and exploit Indigenous communities and our resources. And so just kind of my overarching conclusions for today is as Native nations, we really need data-informed policy, but we have to do so ethically. We have to ensure that we recognize Native nations as the rights holders we are and have proper collaborative consultation or consent built into the entire process. We need data-driven for these resilient decision makings, and I think that so many of you have expertise that could benefit Native nations in terms of thinking about how to ethically protect those data moving forward. And the very last thought is, since I'm here at MIT today, I really want to recommend this piece by Max Liberon, Nature Geosciences, that really questions how do our disciplines, our pedagogical norms, and our research methods benefit from access to Indigenous lands, life, and knowledge. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.